This event is one of several that are happening in different places. We have crypto parties happening in Kiel and Frankfurt in Germany and Sao Paulo in Brazil today. All of them have a different format according to local interests and local needs. Tomorrow also there's one in Brighton. One of the main people working there is Duncan Campbell, who's the journalist who revealed the echelon system, also made GCHQ public for the first time. So there's a kind of renewed interest in the kind of technology and political structures around surveillance that has been instigated at present by the leaks that Edward Snowden made, but also has a long kind of history in investigative journalism and in different forms of political activism that we're trying to build on. And one of the things that's interesting about the present moment is it brings together different kinds of constituencies. One is kind of academic research into computer science, the internet and digital culture, but also forms of hacking, activism, and different forms of creative industry that we're trying to bring together in this event. So for us, whilst a lot of the debate is around the question of privacy in very simple terms, something that we're also interested in as a cultural form, what's happened in terms of the way in which the internet has changed from early 90s to the mid-90s to the present day. How has that system gone from being something at least ostensibly open, dynamic, and creative and experimental to something which has basically become, in many respects, a giant honey trap for the intelligence services? One of the things we want to maintain today is that we want to reclaim the internet and keep the internet exciting, keep the internet a place of invention and experimentation, a place of culture as well as simple command, control, and communications. So what we see as necessary, especially coming from a place like Goldsmiths, is to think about the way in which the internet is not only a technical system whose politics can be solved by technical resources such as good software, proper data hygiene, and so on, but also something that is deeply political but deeply cultural. The reason why we think privacy and encryption are important is because they're also cultural things. They're not simply technical solutions. They're things that allow us to have different kinds of relations between people and machines, and between machines and machines. So in the way that we have a sophisticated culture, when we talk to each other, we have different modes of talking to each other. We may whisper, we may speak in a way such as I'm speaking, we may perform, we may play music, and so on. We have different kinds of relationships that are intimate, some are public, some are familial, and so on. We think that digital culture also needs this kind of complexity and subtlety. And part of the need for a substantial and significant digital culture that attends to human culture is sophisticated literacy in technology, and also the ability for some things to remain private, some things to remain secure, and some things to be public in different kind of ways. And it's the sophistication of the ways in which things become public, become playful, become open to experiment, and the way in which different kinds of political, social, cultural subjects are able to be formed through technology that we see as fundamental. And so the revelations that we've all found out through Edward Snowden and others have really kind of spurred an impetus towards reinvestigating what digital culture is and emphasizing that internet culture needs to be based on a political understanding and a cultural understanding of technology, in which crypto plays a large part. So today you've got a range of different kinds of speakers, different kinds of workshops. We encourage you really to kind of take advantage of all of the workshops If you can't get to a particular workshop because you're going to another one, the material will be online through the Crypto Party website, through the CryptoFestival website, to get hold of the material, get hold of the software. There are manuals to download to train yourself how to use this technology. And there will be future crypto parties in London, across the UK, and across the world. So do feel part of the community that's running these events in order to train up in terms of both understanding the wider infrastructural and cultural context, the wider political context, but also how to get your hands on specific tools. So in order to frame this set of workshops, in order to understand the situation that we're in today, we wanted to bring together a number of different speakers from different backgrounds. We have Ian Brown from the Oxford Internet Institute and Associate Director of their Security Centre, also author of a number of books and co-author of a number of books around the politics of the Internet and of software. One I could particularly recommend is Regulating Code, which came out earlier this year from MIT Press. He's also active in the Open Rights Group, who have a stall outside. Many of you will know about the Electronic Frontier Foundation. In a sense, they're the UK analogue to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, an organisation that is very much worth supporting and taking part in. Wendy Grossman, also on the Advisory Council of the Open Rights Group, and really one of the most kind of significant figures in the debate around the Internet over the last couple of decades in the UK. One of the first journalists to work extensively in this field. The author of Net Wars book in '98, which I think was probably the first book to kind of systematically analyze the dark side of the Internet, let's put it that way, or the way the Internet is coupled with systems of governance and of state power. We also have George Denisis from University College London, who's a reader in security and privacy engineering, one of the leading security experts in the UK, and operating the computer science department at UCL. Marianne Franklin, who we're going to start with, is from the Media and Communications Department at Goldsmiths and a member of the Internet Rights and Principles Dynamic Coalition, who will kind of introduce their work and talk about the context of Internet regulation. So there'll be talks coming from many different angles, but importantly, one of the main angles that we have in this session is from you. So there'll be talks one after the other for about 10 or 15 minutes each. If there's any direct questions for clarification, do feel free to ask the speaker directly. But generally, we'll have about 40 minutes to an hour of presentations, and then we've got an hour of questions and answers. So do feel at that point, that's the time to really open up the discussion. Okay, thanks very much.
I'm going to start a very old-fashioned way. Old school is good. This is what I'm talking about today, the Charter of Internet Rights and Principles for the Internet, which has found its way into hard copy for the first time this year, 2 months ago. It has existed online for the last 2 or 3 years, and it is based at the Internet Governance Forum, which is one of the newest UN organizations around. Its existence, as always, quite tenuous, but nevertheless it has been meeting for 8 years, the Internet Governance Forum, and it is arguably the only place in the UN where NGOs, individuals, academics can get to relatively easily. What they do when they're there is another story. And one of the things we did when we were there is sit down and think about online and human rights. These are two completely different paths, and usually the human rights community works in its own ways, has to deal with appalling situations on the ground. What happens online is often very, very far removed from the work that Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International are involved in. So that's that group. Then there's a whole other group, many of whom represented here today, have been going in this area for 20, 30 years, ever since the Internet was even thought of, about a platform on which people can actually exist in a diverse, and inclusive way. And as Matt's pointed out, things have been shifting. So I wanted to start today with 1949, Eleanor Roosevelt, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Very high level, very, very up there. 21, 22 clauses about human rights. So this is a document all of us have just taken for granted over the years. So how on earth do you link this to what is going on online? Well, this is what we came up with. This was the model. So we kind of policy hacked, looked at the 22 clauses of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and said, yes, of course, it's great. We can just assume that those rights exist online, but we have to be more specific. What do we mean when we say freedom of expression online? Is it just the same? What do we mean when we're thinking about freedom of movement and the rights to association online? So we had to get really quite specific. And that's what we came up with. And that's the sort of, people call it a high-level framework, but I don't think it's that high level. It's actually a bottom-down initiative that started in 2008, 2009 within a UN meeting. So immediately there's this disconnect. Human rights activists go, oh, that's the internet, nothing to do with us. Hackers, communities, underground kind of internet activists say human rights far too highfalutin, far too abstract, difficult to hang on to. Point well taken. So the Charter is a kind of framing to get not just governments but also corporate management, corporate research and development departments, these really, really highly skilled coders to consider what sort of code are you writing? Are you being led by the technical, by the code, or are you thinking about the human rights aspect, namely, are you allowing in your coding people to exist with different languages, with different interfaces, with different generations of software? Now, there are many coders who are already very well attuned to these ideas and these principles, but of course, money rules in the internet game. In the internet galaxy, money rules, market share rules. And now, since Snowden, the ability to use online life for all sorts of purposes has become very, very high profile. So in a sense, Snowden has done anybody working at the intersection between human rights, however defined, and online life, has actually done us all a favour, because suddenly this isn't funny, this isn't odd, this is actually really hot news. So, it's very easy to connect now the issues about access, about freedom of expression to what was happening in the Arab uprisings. We can talk about it now in terms of unmitigated, unreasonable, and excessive forms of surveillance and tracking. Great. But nonetheless, lawyers, government departments, foreign officers, internal officers, procurement people, managers in university institutions have to make enormous decisions. Who do they outsource the email services to? What kind of platforms do they allow workers to use? What kind of access are we allowed? So even rights in the workplace are now at stake. And as money gets tight, expenditure has to be cut, and the internet becomes a huge, huge business opportunity in the global south. India, Brazil, China, the largest number of internet users going online are in the non-Western world. These are the new users, okay? So there's huge stakes. So what are we doing here? In this little booklet, and this is rather dry language, because when you're working at the UN, you've got to talk a certain way. Okay, you've got to persuade policymakers that what you're doing is serious and legally viable. So what the real idea was, apart from experimentation, but the experimentation hacking kind of idea was, let's see if we can make the Universal Declaration of Human Rights apply online. Almost sacrilege. This is a sacred document. You don't unpack a sacred document like UDHR. It's good enough. That wasn't the intention to say it wasn't good enough. It was the intention to apply it and adapt it. So these three actual basic things was to actually get a framework so that anyone who's interested in the future of the internet and whether human rights are being abused, protected, or are able to be enjoyed, this framework allows you to sort of find common ground. So a shared reference point. The second thing is to be authoritative, which is why it was very much locked into legal standards at the UN level, which makes it a bit dull, makes it a bit dry, makes it also quite hard to access if you're more interested in less governmental ways of working. You don't want to be involved in this, but you need to actually get policymakers to understand that this stuff is serious, that they're not just buying a neutral piece of technology, that this technology is coded with values, it's coded with ideas about access and use, coded with linguistic assumptions, and ways of working. So we needed an authoritative document that actually could relate to rights-based norms, because this is about agenda setting. It's about framing the way people even debate the issue, right down to the person who's managing your department at work. Okay, and the third one is to use it as an advocacy tool. Basically, 21 clauses, the internet now and human rights are now intimately connected, physically, technically, culturally, and politically. And this has only just been recognised at the UN level last year. The Human Rights Council, difficult place for many people to work, but it was recognised by the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, Frank LaRue. He said, the rights online, the rights we have on the ground should be enjoyed and should be protected online. So no one can stop you saying what you want online, in principle. And that was a very important symbolic moment. However, of course, the work has only just begun with the after effect of Snowden. So 21 clauses, quite legal, quite dense language. You know, if you're going to try and persuade a team of software developers that this stuff actually affects their work, you have to boil it down. And so the main advocacy tool is actually 10 principles, which has been put forward differently. And you can see already this is fairly high-range ideas. Accessibility, the internet should be accessible. There should be human rights built and coded into the way it works. It should be universal, net neutrality being a very key issue there. And some very sort of high aspirational ideas. Okay, so it boils down to that. And these 10 principles in themselves I've used in class, I've used in high schools, and they get people thinking. Privacy, our premise, you know, privacy by default. Now that, of course, is a whole issue for debate in itself. The thing about the internet, we know it's kind of open. The kind of sort of privacy and openness seem to be in tension. Are they? At which point are they? And which point they are not. So what to do next? Well, this is something that we have to think about next. Now that Snowden's and WikiLeaks, of course, prior to that, now there's a critical mass forming that actually what we do online affects how we work, how we live, how we interact, how we make love, how we get married, how we contact our parents when we're living away. You know, it's no longer a disconnect between offline life and online life. So the fact that human rights are already very fragile on the ground, people are still being killed and murdered. There are like hundreds of journalists, 54, 64 journalists this year alone have been killed in action. So the freedom of expression that journalists are basing their work on is currently threatened quite physically. But that's also threatened by being put in prison when you publish something online that's not acceptable to a particular government. That's also threatened by the unadulterated and extreme forms of ad tracking and surveillance that corporate entities do, Facebook, Google, all the rest. This stuff isn't like saying, okay, now we've done it, we've got a nice little charter here, a nice little book, you know, done and dusted. The work has only just begun with Snowden, because my final point is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was born out of suffering, was born out of World War II, was born out of extreme suffering, murderous, genocidal events. Very powerful document, and anybody who wants to sneer at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights can speak for myself. Try rewriting it. Try applying it, and then you realise what an amazing piece of work it is. It's an amazing piece of work. It's not perfect, okay? But it was an amazing thing to work with. So hacking it was kind of like respect by the end of it, okay? So the final point is that the Charter of Human Rights and Principles as a framing, as an advocacy tool, as a way to try and think these really complex domains in one screen, is born out of concern. Not quite the same. Born out of concern. And out of the need to think ahead, to think outside the box, but yet to think in a recognisable way for those people who make the laws, those people who vote or don't vote into power. And those people who have power by default, namely the service providers who basically run the internet. So it's a human-centred internet development, human-centred future that we're looking for by using the Charter in this way. It raises more questions possibly than it could possibly answer, so it's not a solution. It's not a solution to all the problems. It needs more and more technical people involved to push it forward in the way we want to bring it. Because now that Snowden's, you know, now the cat's out of the bag, everybody's now a human rights activist at the Internet Governance Forum. Everybody's human rights activist at the Internet Governance Forum. Now that, it's good, but it has some issues there. So I hope that's sort of enough for now. It's the first talk this morning, so that's enough. Okay.
Let's hope that
I'm now going to start tweeting.
Just what George is setting out, if you see in each room that these pieces of paper on the wall, which give you Wi-Fi access. So there's a username and password. Once you've taken it, selected a particular one, cross it out so no one's duplicating. So there's 500 of those available for the day.
Do you know how to turn this on?
Yeah, it should be.
That's a bit of a scary thing to do. So where do you put this on?
The room.
Okay. And where did you put that? Should I do this without slides?
Yeah, I mean, if you have that.
I had nice animations, but okay, so I'll try to do this without slides, so you will have to bear with me, and it's going to be fine. There are two great unsolved problems in computer science, the department I come from at UCL. I'm George Danezis, I'm a reader at UCL. The first unsolved problem is how to connect to a printer. The second unsolved problem is how to connect to a projector. Everything else, including crypto, we can take care of. So, I've been invited here, and I would like to thank the organizers for actually taking care of organizing this event, to talk a little bit about the technical aspects of protecting computer systems through cryptography. And in particular, because of all the revelations we have seen in the last few months now, there are so many that apparently they're going to last us for many more months and many more years, everybody is wondering, what can they do? Is it the case that it is inevitable that if we want our society to use computers and networks, we will inevitably end up being under constant surveillance by powerful governments, big companies, or basically anyone else who can hack into a little bit of infrastructure, which in the limit means pretty much everybody. So I wanted, first of all, to start off by saying, what is cryptography good for at the end of the day, right? Because everybody says that the solution to some of these problems that we've seen is cryptography. So now, first of all, let's talk about what cryptography is really good for, and I think we all understand that can solve one specific problem, which is that if Alice and Bob, who are the traditional participants in the online world, as we cryptographers think about them, they want to basically talk to each other. Let's say they're in love with each other, and they want to use a computer network to exchange dirty messages with each other and have cybersex, which is something that lots of people do these days, right? And as we understand that we do not want to have David Cameron in our bedroom, we probably do not want the government to also overhear our conversations with our partners online either, right? Now, this problem is really the original problem with which cryptographers have been grappling with, and we actually have extremely good solutions for it. Alice and Bob trust each other, so they can use a number of secure encryption technologies to protect their communications and make sure that no one can overhear what they say. If they're worried about even the fact that they're communicating somehow being controversial, they can even use anonymizing solutions such as onion routing networks like Tor to hide the fact that they're communicating with each other. If they're worried about anyone discovering after the fact they have been talking to each other, they can use off-the-record messaging. That is another technology that I think is being presented in another session here on how you can install it and use it. So when Alice and Bob, in brief, trust each other and want to talk securely with each other, we have extremely good solutions for that. The problems start occurring in the case where it is not anymore just Alice and Bob who trust each other that want to talk to each other securely, but instead if it is two participants and two principals that do not actually trust each other. One particular field that I have spent quite a bit of time working in the last few years is the field of smart metering. In this case, we have a household, let's say that's Alice's house, that has a smart meter that records how much electricity Alice is using every half hour. So at quite a bit of granularity, it can detect when Alice is in the home, when it's out, when the washing machine is on, when it is not on. And now Bob, instead of being Alice's partner and trusted by Alice, is instead the electricity company. And so the electricity company says, well, I would like to have access to these readings in order to be able to bill you, Alice, in a very fine-grained way. And Alice thinks about it and says, well, I'm not really sure I want to give you this data because I don't know what else you're going to be doing about it. Okay? So now it is not anymore clear that this very traditional idea of cryptography that allows us to have a very secure pipe from Alice to Bob helps at all here. Because even if we use the traditional cryptography where Alice encrypts the data and sends it to Bob, she's actually worried about the data being known to Bob to start with, right? Not just anyone in the middle observing it. Now, our society has settled for a very, very straightforward solution to that problem. And I say solution, it should really be in inverted comma. Bob, the energy company in this case, says, well, tough. You will have to give me that data, otherwise your bill is going to be more expensive. Or otherwise I will not be able to provide you social networking services if we talk about Facebook, or email services if we talk about Hotmail or Gmail, or search services if we talk about Google. And this is really the settlement that we have reached, it seems, that, if you want to have access at all to the information society as we understand it today, well, it's tough. The only choice you have is to give away your data. And that's it, right? And sometimes the pill is sweetened in that you give away your data through a secure encrypted connection, so that at least maybe some people in the middle of it may not be able to observe it, but fundamentally you're giving it to someone that you would rather not have it. Now, the problem with this solution that we have reached is, of course, that once the data that you are sharing is in the hands of someone you don't trust, they may use it for other purposes. They may use it to, for example, try to target you with more advertising, or to try to find out which tariff they should put you on to extract as much money as they can from you. Or, and this is the worst thing, they can actually sell the data to third parties, like your insurance company that might be interested in finding out what your habits are when you're at home, or if you're waking up in the middle of the night, which might be an indication that you may be ill, or anything like that. Furthermore, and this is what we have been seeing in the last 6 months, once the data is in the hands of a third party, the governments of this world are very tempted to say, can we also have a look? Can we also have a peek at the data? Don't worry, we're not going to do anything with it. We're just going to check if people are terrorists. If they are, then we will find embarrassing things about them. If they're not, nothing bad is going to happen. So we have created this culture where the data is shared with people who would rather not share it. The governments then end up peeking at it, and we have the situation we have today in our hands. Now, there is a sense of inevitability in all this. The sense that, well, clearly, if, for example, your electricity company needs to compute some bill on your data, well, they clearly need the data. How else will they be able to find out how much electricity you use at any time to find out how much you should pay for the whole month, right? I mean, and this sense of inevitability is all the time discussed around and used to support that design choice that we have made to build our systems in the way I have described. Yet, not only it is not inevitable that we build the systems as I have described their build today, but in fact I can just tell you 3 options in which we can use to build those systems that do not exhibit this kind of promiscuous sharing of data with parties that we do not trust. Okay? So the first option, for example, and that does not actually involve any cryptography even, is, let's say, for the smart meter that is in Alice's house, to compute the bill without the data ever leaving the household. In that way, the smart meter is given the tariffs that electricity costs at any time of the day, can basically run the tally of how much electricity is used at any time and how much it should cost, and just send back to the electricity company the total amount the household should pay for the month. In theory, the electricity company already has to entrust the meter with working correctly because they have to rely on the readings in any case, right? So that, in theory, should solve the problem of computing bills without, for example, giving data out. So that's a very straightforward solution. The problem with a lot of these solutions is that, for example, smart meters, the dirty secret about smart meters is that they're not actually that smart. They're actually pretty simple devices. They're less computationally empowered than your mobile phone or even than a Raspberry Pi. Okay? So the electricity companies say, well, you know, we want to keep our infrastructures very simple. So this solution may not be appropriate. And this is why we have more complex solutions that do rely on cryptography, in fact, to provide alternatives to you having to provide all your data to third parties all the time to do simple functions like computing, let's say, a bill. So the second option that is privacy friendly that you may use is to say, well, my household may have a very simple meter that cannot actually compute the bill, but it also has another about 5 or 7 computers. Now, I work in technology, so I do not assume that everybody has 5 or 7 computers in their household. But these days, basically, a Raspberry Pi, as I mentioned before, will cost you £25. Most people have in their pockets a mobile phone that actually can do serious computations and that is connected to the internet. So a second option for example, computing the bill without sharing your data with your electricity company is to say, I will use one of my devices to pick up that data from the smart meter, decrypt it on my device so that no one can actually see it except for my own device, compute the bill there, and only provide the bill to my electricity company. And this way, again, in a very straightforward manner, the electricity company can learn how much you should pay them without actually learning whether you were at home at particular times or not. Now, there is one problem with this approach, which is that, of course, if your bills or other information that companies rely on are computed on your devices so that you don't have to share your data with the world, how do they know it's correct? You could, of course, lie. You could say, well, you know, I didn't happen to consume electricity this month. Please don't bill me anything, right? And that is a serious worry. And this is the first magic property of modern cryptography, beyond this idea of providing a secure channel, which is that using modern cryptography, you can prove that one of your devices did a computation correctly, so for example, computed the bill correctly, without being able to cheat on how you compute the bill, one, and without having to reveal the inputs that went into that computation, without having to actually reveal the readings in your household that you want to keep secret. Okay? So that is a property that we call zero knowledge, and there are zero knowledge proofs that allow you to show that computations are correct without revealing information about them. And this now is the first property of cryptography that goes beyond this idea of providing a secure channel between Alice and Bob, and really helps protect your privacy in the case that there are distrustful parties that want to actually do some computations with each other. So that was option 2. Finally, there is option 3, which is even more magical in terms of the cryptography it uses. Maybe Alice does not actually have any devices on her own at home. There are some households that may not have any devices. But maybe Alice will say, well, I do not want to entrust my data to my energy provider, but at least I believe that there exists a coalition of some third parties that will not all collude together to violate my privacy. For example, she might say, well, I know that Privacy International, org, and the EFF will not all work with each other to collude and violate my privacy. So what if they could effectively act as my agents, my proxies, and they could perform that computation collectively for computing my bill without them learning what the actual readings from my household were, and without them being able to cheat, of course, the energy company. This way, we could have maybe a coalition of parties that could perform these computations instead of requiring Alice and Alice's device to perform these computations in order to preserve privacy but still do computations on private data. And it turns out that, indeed, every time I speak actually to the energy industry, they say, well, that would be nice, but it's just impossible, right? I mean, how can that be, right? And in fact, we have very good, again, cryptographic technologies that allow us to do what is called secure multi-party computation. What is secure multi-party computation? It is exactly the ability to offload on third parties some computation in such a way that they, again, do not learn what the secret data of that computation is, and yet they can produce an authoritative result, such as a bill that other people can rely on. So that's a third option where we can use modern cryptography, again, beyond just as a secure channel, to do computations without revealing secret data. So I just wanted to give you a feel here about, this sense of inevitability that we have, in the sense that if we want to participate in modern information societies, we're asked all the time to give data to people that we frankly would rather not be sharing data. And there is a danger in thinking that crypto is just about Alice talking to Bob, because of course we want to have an information society where people can do things with people they do not fully trust, right? And as I mentioned, there are many options for enabling this. It is false that it is inevitable that we have to actually build the systems to perform all these important functions in a privacy and friendly way. And finally, I would like to say, engineering is all about these options. Very often, politicians, managers, company directors will tell you, well, this is how the technology works. But believe me, we are building these technologies, and the technologies are built to fulfill social and economic goals. And the reason why technologies have been built in a privacy unfriendly way today, it is because basically no one has asked, or no one had an interest in building them in a privacy-friendly way. If society now decides, if you decide to demand that our technologies are built in a privacy-friendly way, we can deliver that. And we can get most of the benefits of a modern information society without having and without opening the door to massive privacy violation. Now, hopefully my presentation will be online, and I have very nice little animations with Alice and Bob having conversations that will help you follow this a bit more carefully. But I'm happy to take questions as well at the end of the panel. Thank you.
I don't have slides. Marianne has talked about internet governance, and George has talked about how crypto can protect you in some very interesting ways. But when I started getting interested in crypto, it was 1992. How many of you were not born in 1992? Okay, you're all at least grown up. How many of you were not born in 1976? Wow. Okay, well, 1976 is not a year I picked at random. It's a year I picked because before that, this gathering would have been completely impossible. And the reason is that before 1976, crypto was something that only people like GCHQ and NSA did. There was no such thing as the crypto community. There was the secret intelligence services who used crypto, and there was everyone else. And what happened in 1976 was a guy named Whit Diffie came up with the notion of public key cryptography, and not just Diffie. It was Whit Diffie, Martin Hellman, and Ralph Merkle. And they came up with this notion of public key cryptography that would allow strangers to spontaneously use cryptography to protect communications between them. And it was a complete change in how crypto was used. And when you talk about using something like PGP to protect your email, that's exactly the origin. That is public key. The techniques we use for that are public key cryptography, which perhaps Ian will explain next. So what happened was that in the late 80s, you started having cheap computers. And so all of a sudden, it started to become possible to think about having an individual do strong cryptography on a computer that they had in their house. So in 1991, a guy named Phil Zimmerman wrote and released PGP, and it found its way onto the internet. Now, you have to understand that at the time, the way people thought about crypto was the thing that saved everybody's bacon in World War II. It was a strategic military weapon. And so when all of a sudden you started having crypto available on the internet, which people were beginning to use, and being able to use it at home on their personal computers, there was a lot of panic. And so the things that we're seeing today with the Snowden revelations and the way people have behaved, the way the NSA and GCHQ have behaved, are a direct consequence of the battles that we had in the early 1990s, which are sometimes collectively called the crypto wars. So 1991, PGP is released onto the net. And one of the reasons PGP was released onto the net was that there seemed to be a threat that the US government would actually make it illegal for individuals to use strong cryptography. One of the big issues that came up at the time was moves to try to force people to deposit a copy of their private key with either with a government agency or a trusted third party. I think in Britain the idea was that we all trusted the banks, so we should give them our private keys. They were really surprised when it turned out people didn't actually trust their banks that much, which we turned out to be right about in 2008. So I remember Privacy International, which was very active in these things, had these meetings called Scrambling for Safety, where you would see these government people get up and explain why key escrow was really, really important. Can you guess the 4 reasons why the 4 things that meant that key escrow was really, really important? Who do we want to catch? 1? 2?
Drug dealers.
3? Not quite. So we have pedophiles, terrorists, and drug dealers, and the 4th one is organized crime. And the physicist Timothy May started calling these the 4 horsemen of the infocalypse. And, and I remember one Scrambling for Safety day where one of the government guys got up and said, "We have to protect against the..." Do you remember who it was? Ian? Yeah, no, it wasn't. I don't think it was Nigel. But anyway, we have to protect against these things. And as soon as he said pedophiles, everybody burst out laughing. And he got really upset, like we were in favor of child abuse. And we're going, no, you don't understand. So the reason in the end that key escrow didn't happen and crypto finally got deregulated was, as usual, money. It turned out that the peacetime uses of crypto to secure electronic commerce were probably more, the need for that was probably outweighed the desire to protect everything and see everything. But what we now know is that having lost on key escrow, the Circuit Services proceeded to go do what you do, which is you don't really try to break the crypto, you try to go around the crypto, because the problem with crypto is no matter how much the data is encrypted, at some point, for someone to read it or work with it, there has to be a moment when it's in clear text. And that's the moment you go for and the moment you attack. I'm slightly derailed here because Ross Anderson just walked in, and he knows more about all of this stuff than probably the whole rest of the room put together.
Just imagine I'm Fred when
Fred? Which Fred?
Randall Carson.
Oh, Fred Schultz. Fred Schultz. Yeah, my old friend Fred Schultz. He used to run a laundromat. And then he was a folk singer, I think. Anyway, so it seems to me clear that what we have now is a classic arms race where we will keep trying to devise systems that protect our privacy, and the intelligence services will keep trying to break through them. And I think it's going to require a lot of very considerable cleverness. And I think one thing you have to keep in mind is the limits of cryptography. One of my favorite quotes comes from the science fiction writer Bruce Sterling, who got up at the Computers, Freedom, and Privacy Conference in about 1994 or 95 and said, "Mathematics is not your friend." And what he meant was, at the time, you had these sort of crypto activists, cypherpunks, who would just quiver passionately about, "You will pry my private key out of my cold, dead fingers." There were a lot of analogies to guns. Now, this was in the States, where, of course, analogies to guns don't have quite the same resonance that they do here. And so the idea was that crypto was something that enabled us to keep the balance of power between citizens and the state. You know, we could protect our privacy, and they couldn't get in. As we know, that didn't work out quite as well as we hoped. So the limits to cryptography, when you sit down and when you go to one of the workshops later and you learn how to encrypt your email and your data on your laptop, remember a few things. First of all, that the safer you feel you are, the bigger the risks you're likely to take. People posted a lot of stuff to Facebook when they thought that Facebook was a safe private space. Don't make the mistake, of thinking that what you encrypt on your laptop is never going to be seen by you. You have to think carefully about the risks you're actually taking. Crypto will not protect metadata if it is often more significant that somebody can see that you email somebody 50 times a day than that they read the contents of the email that says, "Have you got the keys?" There are lots of problems. When I wrote a few years ago, I wrote a guide to installing GPG, and by the end of it, I concluded that it was just too damn difficult for most people. And I think that's still true. There are lots of little niggling things that you have to pay attention to when you use it. For example, whether or not the file you attach to your email is encrypted. And I think the web of trust and managing people's keys is genuinely difficult for most people. And I don't think it's a mystery when I look at these tools. I don't think it's a mystery why they have not been mass market successes. They are too complicated and they are too difficult. Where people use cryptography is where it's built into the infrastructure and they don't have to think about it. GSM with encrypted calls and SSL when you send your credit card details to an electronic retailer. Those are things where you don't think about them beyond checking that the little padlock on your browser. How many of you have ever checked that the little padlock on your browser is actually closed? Wow. Not maybe a third. And so I do think that many users are still excluded from using crypto. And one of the things that I really hope the crypto community does in the process of trying to come up with new tools is to come up with tools that more people can actually use. I think that's going to be hard because the other problem is there doesn't seem to be much of a business model. It seems to be very difficult to sell the mass market privacy tools as privacy tools because that's not what people don't buy a computer to think about privacy. They buy a computer to communicate. Alongside this internet history that I've gone through just a little bit, one of the things that happened in the crypto wars was we started seeing the birth of digital rights organizations. Privacy International was the obvious first one. Open Rights Group came along sometime later, but as you'll see from the stall outside, has adopted quite a few privacy issues, including crypto. And there was also the Foundation of Information Policy Research, which was very active in trying to make legislation like the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act less terrible than it was going to be. And Ian Brown is going to explain all of that.
Thanks, Wendy. I'm going to try and complement what George was saying and what Wendy was saying. I think the technology is very important, and as George was saying, it's not just the secure email, it's not just the Tor. It's taking a lot of the services that you take for granted in your everyday lives, like getting your electricity and your gas and so on, rebuilding those in a privacy-friendly way, which is possible. If there's nothing else I would like you to take away from this session, it's what George says, that privacy is possible if we demand it, but we have to demand it. You know, just sitting back and hoping someone else will look after it won't work. We know that now. Even installing PGP and Tor and all the wonderful crypto tools you can find out there today, that's important, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. What those tools will do, as Wendy was saying, they will raise the cost of mass surveillance. They'll make genuinely mass surveillance, in terms of what GCHQ and NSA have been doing, we now know, impossible. It won't stop them going after individuals or groups of individuals. That's probably okay, as long as there are oversights, as long as there are rules in place to make sure they aren't abusing those capabilities. Here's a question for you. Is there anyone in the room, and this is a genuine question, and you may think this, I won't argue with you, but is there anyone who thinks under no circumstances should, whether it's GCHQ or a police force or some other organ of the state, be able to intercept the communications of somebody that they have a lot of evidence is trying to use a really emotive example, do another 9/11 or 5th of July 2005, bombings in London? Does anyone think that? I very occasionally have met one or two people that think that. Jacob Applebaum is one.
Without evidence, then they shouldn't have that.
So I would say the evidence bit is key, and who checks that there is genuine evidence, especially if it's all done behind a sort of super cone of silence, which is, we now know as well, one of the big problems. What develops behind that cone of silence may not be what the rest of society thinks is going on there.
It would have to be such that they couldn't gain an access order,
yes.
court order to gain access.
Indeed, and that would be one of the safeguards that I've been campaigning for years to have in place, that even intelligence agencies should have to get a high court order before they start investigating individuals. So that comes on to why political activism is important. You can have all the technical tools in the world. One problem, though, is if governments, as Wendy was describing, as the US government did, and with the assistance of the UK in the 80s and the early 90s, try to ban the tools, or ban the export of the tools, or ban the technology, or in more subtle ways, require industries like the electricity industry to install smart meters in everyone's home, without the kind of privacy technologies that George was describing, or actually, not even going that far, the situation that we're in, that for the reasons George was saying, it's slightly more expensive to have those privacy-friendly smart meters. It might mean that the electricity industry doesn't get to play out their fantasy of becoming Facebook. That's what it is. I've been in the meetings where, after lots of questioning, they will admit that they want that data because they think they can then profile all their customers, sell them new appliances, if nothing else. I mean, of course, do lots of other things as well, as George was saying. Just that one smart meter can be very revealing about all sorts of aspects of your life. You know, how many people are regularly sleeping in your flat is one of the questions it will obviously show. Are you getting up in the middle of the night is another very good predictor of physical and mental health problems that might be something you don't want your insurer to know, you probably don't want your employer to know. So, Wendy mentioned at the end of her talk a sort of a brief history of digital rights activism in the UK. Ross is here. Ross and I and other people. Casper Bowden, you might have come across online. In the late 90s, in response to some of the UK government's plans to regulate cryptography, to try to mandate key escrow, as Wendy was talking about initially, then morphed into what became the Regulation of Investigating Powers Act. set up the Foundation for Information Policy Research, which you can still, there's a lot of interesting history from that whole era on the FIPA website, fipr.org. Privacy International has been very involved. Is Matt still in the room? One person from PR is here, is talking about their surveillance index later today. But I'm mainly going to talk about the Open Rights Group. And I think one reason org, and the approach that org takes is important, is it's genuinely grassroots activism. So FIPA and PI are more, well, FIPA is a think tank very explicitly, so it's more the sort of smaller groups of people thinking about problems, trying to explain some of these issues to politicians and to others. So FIPA did a lot of good in the late 90s and early 2000s with regards to RIPA. So Casper Bowden, who was the director then, for example, one of the important victories Casper won whilst RIPA was going through Parliament was to say, if, this may sound trivial to you, but it was a huge win at the time, if the police or some other government agency wants to get access to your metadata, as Wendy was saying, that can often be actually very revealing. So not what you said in the email, but every website that you visited, where your mobile phone location was, who you were talking to. Casper managed at least to persuade the House of Lords that a website, so the URL up to the slash, so the Microsoft.com slash, all sorts of other examples that I could give you that would be more sensitive than that you were looking at Microsoft's website, that should be metadata, but the actual page that you were looking at should not, because it's much more revealing. And you just have to think, for example, about a search engine to see how true that is. When you search for something on Google, for example, the URL will be google.co.uk/ then search, question mark, and then the keywords that you were searching for. Obviously, sometimes you might be searching for things perhaps related to health, again, that you wouldn't necessarily want 500 or 600 government agencies in the UK to have access to, because that's the level that's the number of government agencies. It includes all local councils, it includes prisons, all of the police forces across the UK can self-authorize access to this metadata. They don't even have to go to the Home Secretary to get a warrant, which is what the police would have to do to intercept your actual emails or phone calls. So I think what org has done a very good job in doing is to build out from that more think tank or elite model to broader activism. I think org has now nearly 2,000 paid up members, and that's important for a number of reasons. So do join org, have a look at the website. That's my second takeaway for today. Please, if not org, one of the other groups that's campaigning on these issues, because, of course, a campaign group has much more democratic legitimacy if it has thousands of members than if it is in the end, as much as I respect Ross's views on cryptography, for example. Ross is Ross. A politician can quite legitimately say to someone like Ross or to me or to George, well, it's all very well that you people at Cambridge University or Oxford University think these things, but you weren't elected. How many constituents do you have? That's a perfectly valid response. Whereas if your 2,000 members are writing to their MPs and complaining and organising meetings at their constituency surgeries, turning up to protests and so on, MPs will take much more notice of that, and that's a very positive thing. Something that org is also doing, which I think is important now, is building out local groups through the country. So although the main org offices are in London, and there's an org Sheffield, there's an org North East, there's lots of little local groups, and I think that's important too, because those of us who live in London, of course, you can get caught up in the political swirl of Westminster and so on, but it's important to persuade members of Parliament throughout the country, because ultimately it's them that will be voting on things like RIPA, that this is something that their constituents do care about, and that's a great way to reach people. That's one way that the No to ID campaign, which is another great example of grassroots activism on these issues, was very successful. So No to ID had, I think, dozens of these local groups throughout the country, did lots of cool little activism things like having stalls on their high streets on Saturdays and handing out leaflets. You might think that's very old-fashioned. Why do that when you have a website, you have Twitter? But of course you'll reach all sorts of people that way that might not be connected to the internet at all, but certainly won't be sitting around on a weekend browsing the org or No to ID or FIPA websites. So reaching those less the people that aren't in this room, I don't need to convince you, really. I mean, you're all here already. I hope you'll go further, but the most important thing is to think, well, how many other people can I bring into this battle? Because it is a battle, and it's, the people on the other side are very patient, have enormous resources. So I think NSA's annual budget is $10 billion a year. GCHQ's is £1 billion a year. They've got lots of smart people working for them. They're not stupid. They are thinking, as Wendy said, they lost the key escrow battle and the export controls on crypto battles for all sorts of reasons, one of which was the commercial aspect that Wendy mentioned. That was very important. That was probably the most important reason. But also the Electronic Frontier Foundation, FIPA in the UK, other similar activism groups. But they were patient and they thought of ways around that. So they sort of, we thought they had retreated, but now we know that they have not. And so let me just finish by saying why I personally continue to think this battle is so important. It's, as George was saying, as we move into an information society where everything you do, not just your online activities, but all of your offline activities as well, leave digital traces behind. The intelligence agency's perspective is they should be able to access anything, anywhere, anytime. That was in the NSA's 5-year strategy document that was leaked just a few days ago. They think they should have access to all of that data when they want it. They're not going to be looking at great detail at everyone, because they really, even with $10 billion a year, don't have the resources to do that. But they think if they want to, if they decide that suddenly you're of interest, maybe you've been talking directly, or someone you've been talking to has been talking to someone else who's been talking to someone else that they think is interesting. That's how far we know the NSA is going in the States, to getting access to all phone records and then doing 3-hop analysis, so looking at patterns of calls, not just of the people that you are talking to directly, but 3 hops away, because they can do that with the kind of computing power that they have. That's the vision of the world that the Signals Intelligence Agency have, that they have all that data, and it will allow them to find the one terrorist clique and stop the next 9/11. That's an admirable goal. Society very much wants them to do that, but the collateral damage to privacy I don't need to convince you of. So I will finish and say, please join org, but also please go, and even more importantly than you joining org or one of the other activism groups, tell your friends, especially your non-geek friends, about these issues and try to get them to join this campaign too. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got a period of about an hour, 40 minutes to have a discussion. So any questions for people on the panel? It's also a musical game of musical chairs. Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions. Does anyone have anything you want to say or some clarification?
I have a question. There was an article recently on MIT Technology Review, very sort of challenging title, The Real Problem of Privacy. I don't know if you've seen it. It was stating basically that that in a society it's desirable not only for there to be privacy, but also for there to be a sort of a public sphere and for some penetration into private spheres, not necessarily by governments and authorities and companies, but by other people in society, and that we've sort of lost that during the 20th century, that everything became more nucleified and there was less penetration of people with each other. Do you think that in this society that you have today, with all these mechanized situations, that such a balance is possible again, or are you only going to have these two positions of extremely strong tendency towards privacy and this panopticon reaction?
Well, one of the important things about privacy is it's not just about solitude. It's not just that you can go in your cave and not talk to anyone. Actually, the really important thing that privacy does from a societal perspective is it lets you go and engage with others, but limiting your risks, if you like. So letting you reveal some things about yourself and your situation that you're comfortable about, without thinking there are other parts of your life you don't want to have to reveal to everyone. I think that's the flaw in the argument of people that say, well, we should have a transparent society, like Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, of course, we know why he says it, because it would make him even richer. But David Brin said it.
Doesn't have that.
Right. I think that's one of the flaws with that argument. So Brin's argument, who's a sci-fi writer, was, well, the rich and powerful will always be able to spy on us. Mm-hmm. And the only way to fix the resulting power imbalance is if we can also watch them. So everyone should reveal everything all the time. I don't agree with that perspective, although I understand how he came to it. And I think the idea of surveillance, as some people call it, so the weak looking up at the powerful and revealing information about the powerful, whether that's activists at demos filming the police, as famously happened with Ian Tomlinson, who the Metropolitan Police initially said had been trying to fight them, and then someone had video footage showing no, he'd been completely uninvolved and was just walking by a protest, had been shoved to the ground by a police officer and then died. So I think, yes, that's important, and I think the powerful should be more transparent. But I think I agree with the thrust of the article. We want an information society where people can engage in the public sphere when they want to, but I think protecting their privacy and giving them options is the best way to do that.
Jay Stanley at ACLU has a concept that I really like, which is that what matters is the reverberations in your life of things that, it's not just about what data is disclosed, but what consequences it has for you. I think the line I used once was something about privacy is not about sleeping under a tree in isolation in Wales. It's about being able to eat sand without fear. In other words, it was about a child, but I mean, to be able to do things that are non-conformist and not be I think, because I do think that one of the consequences of the loss of privacy is to push everybody to be exactly the same, because nobody wants to take the risk of being different and sticking out and calling attention to themselves.
Yeah, or ever try new things, because they might make a mistake, but they could never erase that from their public history.
Right.
Could I just bring in something about the very idea of privacy? It's a very culturally embedded idea. Privacy, I think your question's bringing up the idea that privacy means different things in different parts of the world. So there's a trade-off in Western parts of the world between personal individual privacy that we're talking about, and that has a certain traction in our understanding, informed consent, nobody watching me without my permission, you don't share information about myself unless I let you do that. But we're living in I don't know what planet we're all on. This is one of the most camera surveilled societies on, the UK has such an embedding of CCTV. It's long before the internet, these forms of privacy have been chipped away and eroded for many, many years. To me, I think we have to be careful that we don't have the whole conversation be just about privacy. There are other issues. There are issues about access, and sometimes it has to be open access. So it's a question about who owns and controls the material by which the internet works. So I'm a little concerned about throwing the baby out with the bathwater as well, where all these points are well taken. But what Snowden has shown is that a lot of this stuff has been going on already, and it's just become clearer by what we can see online. So if we're going to think privacy only, we might have to think also about disability, about literacy educations, about multiple languages, about diversity. But the fact that if you go to another part of the world, you'll see these machines used in very different ways, with very different interfaces. So our privacy concerns, we have to think past our own noses. It's a very real issue, but I just want to make sure that we think in a comparative and intercultural way about these things, because the stuff has been designed at the core of the Western world, but the real stuff is happening down in other cultures. So I think we need to be a little bit aware of that. Just to make it even more complicated, I'm sorry, but it's not a simple box we're talking about, privacy.
No, like security, privacy is a process, not a product. It's not, you can't just throw privacy into something and
it's not self-explanatory.
Have it work.
It's not self-explanatory. Like in Germany, they want to have a sort of in the Netherlands and Germany, you have a sort of digi-ID. You're private, it's yours, it belongs to you. A lot of privacy conversations about ownership and an individualist understanding of me as one thing, as one person. Many people have many identities and many forms of privacy settings. I don't know if that's an answer, but we have to be aware of that. Yeah, it's a cultural practice as well.
If I could just add to that, sorry, I didn't mind. What always comes to my mind is the story I read about a journalist who went to rural Spain, to a small village, and as soon as he arrived, he went to his own room, and a lot of the people in the village came to help him unpack. And there was no real privacy he found in this sort of small-scale way.
If he was a New Yorker, he freaked out.
He was pretty freaked out, but he realized that in this way that, things like, problems that really strong crypto brings with it would not be so easily possible. Things like organized crime or pedophilia or terrorism. If you're living in a society where there is a sort of social but horizontal social control, which is quite strong, and I'm wondering if that kind of vision, if people in the field are thinking about that, how that might be possible technologically. I don't know.
Okay.
I wanted to just ask about, just to continue sort of Marianne's notions about privacy, because I have a sense that not everybody actually cares about privacy. Most of my conversation with non-tech, non-geek people are, I have nothing to hide, basically. And I think that most Web2 platforms are actually encouraging you to really expose yourself. And I don't know if you've been talking with high schoolers or people in school. They're contributing so much information. They don't care about privacy.
No,
and when you talk to them about that, I don't think that their notion of privacy is quite the same. So I'm just wondering, how do you really engage in that when you have so many reality shows that the notion of privacy is not really there in general? So most people, when you talk to them, they don't care about that.
They think they don't, but the line that I have often used is that do you want your bank statements to arrive on the backs of postcards? And most people will sort of, actually, no, they don't. And when you start to talk to them about the consequences of the loss of privacy, things like being denied credit or being unable to get medical care because the doctor decides that if you smoke and I don't know what, if you're, whatever, in the States that's kind of more of a thing because of private health insurance. But they care very much about the consequences of the loss of privacy. And if you sort of show them the connection between those two things, the things they care about, like the amount of time it takes to get a mistake in a database corrected, and the sort of dispersion of information. But the other thing that always bugs me is I really do think the teenagers care a lot more about privacy than people think. I think a lot of them have become very sophisticated. If you read the surveys, show that they are the most sophisticated users of the privacy settings in Facebook. And the thing you have to bear in mind is that for the average teenager, the threat model is their parents.
Yes, there's lots of research by people like Dana Boyd at Microsoft Research showing that teenagers do care about privacy. They might talk about it in a slightly different way to their parents, but
sometimes they have very elaborate strategies, like one of the ones that she talks about realized that her mother would only ever look to see if she had a Facebook account when she was at school. So she deactivated her Facebook account every morning and then reactivated it when she came home.
Also, there's a very good survey done by the UK Youth, I forgot what they're called, the Youth Forum, about anonymity. They wanted to look about, is it possible to be anonymous and meet other people online and the trade-offs. So privacy kind of comes in there. So you want to see what young people have to say about these things, and they have a very diverse set of responses. So again, privacy is one way to frame these complex issues, but there's always, it's about being able to be who you want to be without someone pursuing you.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily privacy, that's also a positive thing. One thing about a framework like the Charter of Internet Rights and Principles is to say, let's think positively, let's think constructively. We're in a real phase of fear and loathing right now for good reason, but it's got to be careful that we don't sort of start closing everything off. This kind of fear of the bogey, it is out there, but just going out on the street these days in London with the bus and the cars is dangerous.
Did you know there are 22 cameras on a London bus?
Yeah, exactly. We got them all. So I don't know what we do about this, but young people actually find ways to get around the parent and the big brother online, but they want to be able to use it on their own terms. It's the simple as that. They want to be able to use these platforms on their own terms.
Okay, there's a question here.
Is a question about following of the cross-cultural differences,
Yeah.
which I find absolutely fascinating. Question to Wendy, probably. We discussed the splinternet and balkanization of the internet in response to the fact that the privacy clearly is not a global concept. It's very, very finely defined in America and much more acceptable to have no privacy online because it comes from the catalog cultures where there is no right protection for the personal privacy, while in Europe the concept of privacy is much more sensitive. So if we're looking to solve the problem, are we trying to solve too big a problem, and is internet really something that we should consider?
I think it's time for George to say something.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have heard these arguments about the cultural relativity, and I think that they're very real. But I think what the revelations in the last 6 months have told us is that, broadly speaking, no matter what the narrative was in different places, and the narrative in the US is different about privacy than in Canada, than in Europe, than in the Middle East, than in China, the practices were exactly the same from the point of view of the state. Right? So they were kind of sugar-coated in a different way. So, for example, in the UK, we always have been very concerned about all these weird legislations about, that seem very draconian. Whereas in the US, for example, there was never really a very deep conversation about traffic data retention, which was a very contentious issue here in the UK. Now we realize it's because basically there it was just done without any discussion. Whereas here at least there was at least maybe an attempt to bring it in the rule of the law. And as a result, we thought that here, it's very draconian, whereas in the US, liberty is preserved. Actually, this did not map into all this. So although I do believe that there are cultural differences, I don't actually think that the actual practices of the states are that different. The cultural differences are about how it's it's sugar-coated. At the end of the day, the networks and the mechanics of how an intelligence agency runs within a state cuts across many different cultures, despite the fact that, this may not be,
Oh, I have to beg to differ.
Go on.
Yes, you're right, but no, it's not quite that simple. States are complex organisms and they are often competing with each other. So if you look at a certain level, you're right, I get it. And also because they're sharing these tools amongst themselves. The European Union sold surveillance tools to the Egyptian and Tunisian government. So there's been moves within the European Parliament to stop that. There are ways in which, if we say it's all the same, that means there's no way of changing anything.
But let me clarify, maybe.
There's conflict about this, and there are different forces within different governments and different state apparatuses on just these issues. This is the moment where you can actually say, when the Russians are talking about online freedom of expression, they are busy with their particular sense of what is or is not allowed, what they think should not be allowed online. Okay? So they're talking in a different way. But the similarities is because there's money being made by the sale of these tools. But to say that states are all the same at the end of the day means that we have no chance to effect any kind of change at any point. And I find that really depressing.
But I think that this would be depressing. But I don't actually. I think that what I'm saying instead is that there is great hope, in the sense that I think that myself and the people in this room have more in common, let's say, with human rights defenders in Russia than I have with, GCHQ here, right? So the concerns for privacy take particular forms in different places, but to some extent the commonalities and the concerns and how people are affected have some universality.
No, I don't.
Right? And you worked on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so at least you appreciate that. So I think that our causes have a universality despite the fact that they have local characteristics, in the same way as the causes of actually global massive surveillance also has some universality, and this is why there is a big market and it is international, and governments are very helpful to each other in deploying these technologies.
Going back to the village analogy, the thing that the village had that NSA surveillance doesn't is it did have reciprocity. If somebody knew everything about you because you live in a tiny village, you knew everything about them as well. And there was this kind of balance, don't you think?
telephones used to be party lines.
Yes.
Remember back in the day?
There was a great-
I don't think anyone was alive then,
The movie.
Telephones used to be
There is
party
actually a movie that was a Doris Day movie. I think it was Pillow Talk. That enshrines for historical purposes the party line.
Yeah. Know what a party line is? We used to pick up the phone and everyone had the same line. So you rang up someone and you knew that everybody else was listening.
Or they could listen.
They could listen,
Yeah.
and they did listen, and the switchboard. So lots. So I mean.
Should we get to the question there? And then there's one there and one at the back.
For you.
Yeah, I do.
Don't know if it's relevant.
The issue I wanted to raise was if we disagree with Jacob Applebaum and find limits and exceptions, how do we stop romanticising potential terrorist acts and mandating government actions to stop them and creating a so-called necessary and proportional framework to do so? Revelations from Snowden back earlier has told us that this is not potentially, that's not an impossible task. So I wanted to raise the issue of reconciliation between hardcore saying under no circumstances is interception, should it be allowable, and the slippage into the romanticisation of security services and intelligence and the romantic, well, in its perverse sense, potential terrorist act, bring on the pedophiles and everyone else as well.
So what do you mean by romantic?
We are romanticising it by the fact that we are willing to give up our, or allow our states to start upon the slippery slope of interception, the gathering of the metadata.
So it's
for all the precise
exaggeration.
reasons that these government departments want all the data. They want, the measurements of your footprints, the smells in your shower, electricity usage and so on, to start crunching that, profiling that in whatever endeavours at the time. Not merely just the romantic prevention of a potential public threat.
I think you need two things. I think you need the technological base that makes it expensive to do mass surveillance. Not completely impossible, but some of the stuff that George was talking about. If it's trivial to do mass surveillance, they will do it. There's nothing any of us in the room can do to change that. If it's expensive and difficult, and therefore much harder, then the political process, the laws that are in place that govern the activities of those agencies have more chance of actually working. As Marianne was describing, it's important to develop these principles, some of which are, yes, the UDHR dates back to post the Second World War, but sort of timeless principles. How do they apply in today's technological environment? The stuff that Marianne's group has done at the IGF. Also, I don't know if you've seen the website Necessary and Proportionate, where I think that 300 NGOs now around the world have tried to do, just as you were saying, develop detailed rules about when is it necessary and proportionate to allow targeted interception of people that are plotting mass murder. Apart from the few people like Jake, and again, I can understand the perspective even if I don't agree with it. What are the constraints you put in place to say, yes, please stop attempts at mass murder, but as you say, let's not turn that into a very slippery slope that goes much, much broader than that.
I appreciate what you're saying about the use of technologies, whether it be to encrypt emails to make harder use Tor and other such measures. And I think that one of the most positive parts of modern times at the moment is that it's reached the public consciousness at such a depth now that people will, and I think it's an evolutionary, someone else mentioned process rather than thing, and as the public consciousness gets deeper within this, we will change our behaviours, but it may take time.
So I have one comment about this, because I also believe that in a perfect world, indeed there should be social processes that allow limited, very necessary and proportionate targeting of individuals for investigation. The problem with this is that traditionally in our societies, this is the prerogative of a national government. And the problem with the privacy on the internet is which national government, right? Because of course, no matter which country you're in, there is a national government, but probably this national government is a very small part of the global internet and everybody else. And everybody else will not have any laws preventing them spying on you. right? So the fact that, for example, in the UK we will have maybe, as an outcome of all this, greater scrutiny about what our intelligence services may do, that does not mean that the American intelligence services or the Chinese will have any limitations on spying on us.
The industry is already
Right.
using that with bias swapping surveillance
So-
in countries in order to not break their own laws.
Right. So this is the fundamental challenge, though.
From John Perry Barlow's declaration onwards, I take your point.
Well, my
Move on
concern
to the
is
question
also-
here. Oh, sorry, we've got quite a few queued up.
Hi, Wendy was talking about the complexity of crypto tools and the fact that they are impenetrable to most people. And I think the issue of whether most people, as brought up earlier in the question, the issue of whether most people are concerned about protecting their privacy or not is kind of borne out by the interest in Tor that exploded following NSA revelations and the doubling of internet traffic to DuckDuckGo.com and anonymizing search engine. So people aren't, I think there's like a privacy tools market.
Don't you think there's a step change, though, between using DuckDuckGo, which is just changing what you type into your browser bar, and Tor, which you have to install and hits your system performance and stuff like that, and is much more. I mean, DuckDuckGo. I think DuckDuckGo's traffic will stay up, even though you do have to do some retraining of how you use your search engine. I think I'd be very interested to see how many of the people who went to try Tor actually stuck with it.
No, absolutely. I mentioned those to kind of point out the fact that there's interest.
No, there is interest.
People don't care.
There is interest, but when I was writing this manual about GPG, it became apparent that a lot of webmail users would have to change services and therefore email addresses, because something like Yahoo Mail, you can't plug in a crypto module. So a lot of them would have to change the email software. If they use client email software on their computer, they would probably have to change to either Thunderbird or I think Outlook. There were very few email packages for which a crypto module exists, add-in exists. I mean, you were asking people to make a lot of changes in how they work, and I think unless they perceive that there is an immediate threat, the motivation to do it is not going to be there. Now, it depends how much they see the NSA and GCHQ as a threat. I mean, they will for a while, but if it's really a pain and they have to send 500 people their new email address and they have to go back and they have to remember which services are hooked to that their old email address, it's a lot of work. And at some point they're going to say, they're not that interested in me, surely.
Absolutely. My question was actually the next bit. It's like, with that problem in mind, where do you see, what are the positive outlooks do you have on the development of new crypto tools that are maybe more accessible? I mean, where is that field going? Given that there's a market, given that there's at least a superstorm of interest there.
Personally, what I'd like to see is a certain amount of decentralization of the net. I mean, one of the things that's happened in the last 10 years is, 15 years ago, everybody had client email software on their computer and they accessed their email through some server somewhere. Now, a huge percentage of the population get their email from Gmail or Hotmail. So getting that to decentralize some and not have everybody using the same 3 or 4 handful of cloud services, to me, that would be a really positive step, and that actually might even be possible.
So one of the problems that we've had is that we had to retrofit a lot of old technologies that offered no protection for privacy or any other security property, actually, with some protection. And, you can see basically the seams, and it is very unusable. I think that what we can do from now on is absolutely demand that any new technologies that are being fielded, that are being standardized, that are being proposed, come in already with protections fitted in, so that they're thought out. And as Wendy was saying, for some technologies, you just switch it off and it already is protected. And I think this is how privacy protection should work. You should not have to think about it. It should do exactly what you want it to do. The problem with this is, of course, that a lot of these standards are not in your hands. You get to hear about them when they're already in devices. They are more often in the hands of big engineering companies and governments that are lobbying for those standards to be in a particular way or not. And guess what? They're not lobbying for your privacy. They're lobbying the other way around. right? So it's a political problem that we need to be vigilant, and our community now is much more vigilant about making sure that when things are standardized, they are secure by default, and secure means with privacy rather than without, which was the traditional way they were thought to be secure.
And that's why the new EU data protection regulation is important, because it includes a thing saying that technologies have to be privacy by default and by design, and you need those kind of rules, and that's why you need political activism to get those rules through, sometimes in the teeth of opposition from the people George is mentioning.
You know, I do think that the Snowden revelations are the best thing that could have happened to data protection reform, because up until June, you know, U.S. lobbying was really beginning to get somewhere in the EU, and then the Snowden thing happened, and the EU went, wait a minute.
Okay, there's a question at the back.
I think that philosophically it's really important for the people to remember to take the attitude of the U.S. forefathers of the Constitution. I think a lot of people in England don't realize that when they're a bit perplexed as to why Americans want to hang on to their guns, that guns were written into the U.S. Constitution as a right to rebel against the government. The philosophy behind the U.S. Constitution was that the U.S. people had the right to form militias and throw out the government should the government become too tyrannical. And that was a good balance and certainly kept the U.S. government in check for a great many years. It worked. Today, the analogy is the modern equivalent is surveillance and privacy. And I think it's important that within the laws there is the right of the people to rebel against the government. And by giving the government too much power over surveillance and privacy in the name of protecting against terrorism or pedophiles, what you're doing is you're giving away a fundamental right which worked for a long time in the U.S. I know this gun control thing is probably freaking people out.
Well, the first person I heard make that analogy was actually Phil Zimmerman himself in about 92, 93, when he was under investigation by the FBI because PGP was available on the internet. And that was exactly the point he made, was that the Second Amendment, which allows people to have guns, was to ensure the balance of power between the citizen and the state. That said, I'm just going to say I'm in favor of gun control. I'm sorry. You know, I grew up in New York, and people shoot each other.
I think that's more of an issue of psychology because...
let's not do the gun argument now.
The gun argument doesn't work in the UK. That's
no, it really doesn't. The population is too dense.
That wasn't my main point, but I think the philosophy behind it is very important, and it certainly kept the American government in check for a long time. It might be deteriorating now, but
there doesn't be two in check at the moment, but maybe
yeah.
we'll move to here.
There seems to be a slight problem with confusing what is in the public domain and what is in the private domain, and we wish to encrypt what is in the private domain. What is in the public domain, we want to know who's written it, and that, in fact, encryption will allow you to sign things to the encryption, allow signatures, so that things that you carry in public would be signed, so they could be analysed. If you have a software doing that thing, it can be Trojan horsemen sent in and written it. So encryption would have to be, I would imagine, but it would have to be in the architecture. You devise a card which is different for everybody, which would do the encryption for you. Everything on your computer is encrypted then. And anybody who looks at it only gets the encrypted. It can't read it. It's on your computer in an encrypted method.
How can we build encryption into the architecture?
Well, the endpoint weakness, as Wendy said, is always something to be concerned about.
Individually printed, so that it was printed. The logic on the card would do the PGP style de-encryption of any message which is sent to it. You could also send in all your output through that encryption method and all your input, so that in the software it's always encrypted.
But as Wendy said, the human brain can't read encrypted material. It has to be decrypted at some point so it can go into your brain. And at that point, that's where the intelligence agencies will try to step in. So you're missing the point on that, I'm afraid. I also would disagree with what you said about the fact that everything public should be signed. Actually, it's a really important principle of free speech that people have the possibility of anonymous speech, because otherwise they won't be willing to say politically unpopular things.
Oh, you don't have to, though, if you wanted to say it anonymously, you could just say it yourself, but to have somebody carry something into the public domain and not reveal themselves to who they are, you don't know who is producing the libel.
Okay.
If they now simply libel laws as necessary.
Okay, so we've got a question here.
Yes.
We've got
just
5 minutes.
Quick question. I would agree that there's a great deal of naivety around this, and I'm certainly no geek when it comes to this, but I would suggest there's also a naivety, because I've heard the panel mention the law and legislation, and I would suggest there's a certain amount of naivety around that. That's kind of the field that I work in, and what we're seeing here is a symptom, and we're not really getting back to the cause. The cause really is we're trying to close the door, the stable door, after the horse is bolted, really. We're kind of behind the curve. But we need to make the realization that we've actually opened that door. Because we don't. What our situation, what our rights are, we really need to comprehend, and what the legal terms are. Because we're, for all intents and purposes, United States of America, just put an E in front of it, they're estates. They're the United States. We are basically volunteering workers, citizen means worker. We basically are workers on a plantation who have already given up our rights. This is why these governments are moving the way they are. We don't realize that. We don't realize how to take our power back. And this is really another symptom of that process. Until we become more cognizant of the deceptions, or various deceptions and manipulations that governments put in place, because this is where they're backing from. They have this. We make assumptions that we have this thing called freedom. If you take a tribe, or a Native American tribe, or Aboriginal tribe, everybody knew everybody else. They had nothing to hide. The only people that have anything to hide are governments, are these authorities. And if you really want to do the research, 9/11 and 7/7 were inside jobs. If you take the time and trouble to do that.
No, let's stop there, because that's just going completely off the cliff of crazy paranoia.
No. Let's just say that it's off topic.
My
Could I
goodness.
just note about naivety? This is a very different audience than I'm used to talking to, which is why it's so exciting. Look, I'm no pro-government. You know, I'm anti-establishment as anybody else. I may not look at anymore. The point is that governments and private sector actors have worked together hand in hand throughout the history of the internet. The internet has been funded by private money. So it's naive of another sort, it's disingenuous to say it's bad, naughty governments and really goody corporate internet service providers, and we, whoever we are in the middle, are somehow the victims of all this. We're engaging in a Faustian pact.
Compartmentalised thinking is not going to solve this problem.
Yeah. But
no matter
politically,
how safe and secure you might be in thinking that your
Can I just
government's
finish
nice
my
and
point?
friendly.
The point is a political, an ideological, a philosophical, and a technical issue. So here, with all these amazing technical expertise in this room, if you try and solve a problem with a technical solution, you're just back to square one. So we have to think the technical solution within a political premise. We have to think politically and culturally as well as technically. It's not just solved by another technical fix. That's part of the problem.
Okay, we've got 2 questions. We've got 4 minutes. So you first, then you, and then to the panel to finish up.
I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, Brian Carpenter's talk at IETF in Vancouver earlier this month or last month, for me, even though I'm an ex-technical person, was very much of an eye-opener. He said that the technical community in the early days of the internet, when it was being architected, designed, all of the protocols were being designed, allowed ourselves as the IETF and technical community to be swayed by civil intelligence agencies from various governments. That was the first time I've ever heard I would call a founding father of we allowed ourselves get pushed around. So number one, that in my view is the technical community saying we kind of got it wrong. Number two, you mentioned about if we ask for private tools. If you ask the average person on the street, and I mean that with the utmost respect, a very large percentage of them will already have thought, I thought my stuff was private, was already secure. So you're right in what you say, we need to ask for them, but first of all, we need to be told that they're not secure. The whole Snowden revelations, I think, certainly have blown the doors off any barn that may have been there. But it needs to be explained to people why they're not secure and that you need to ask for them in these ways.
Okay, if you want to ask a question, then we can respond as a group.
So the point just being made before about not just being a technical solution, but being policy and other stuff as well. I think that really is shown up in the suggestion by a Microsoft engineer recently that we can have DRM for privacy. And so the idea is that you send your private data to someone with a key, and they click a thing saying, I promise not to do this.
See, what is this with everything having to be in the cloud?
Right. That too. But so yeah, I think the perfect thing there is like just shows how much you need the policy side, and really the so-called DRM for privacy is just like I guess you could call it like crypto washing maybe, like using using the DRM label for something that sounds socially useful in order to give it legitimacy, when actually it's just all it is encrypting, plus then having this supporting infrastructure of regulators who check that the person on the other side is actually living up to their promises. So I think that's like a good example.
I think that's one for George.
Yeah, so I think that there are very subtle ways in which policy and technology interact. And I think it is a mistake to say that there are technical solutions purely, but it is equally a mistake to say that, this privacy thing, it's a complex social technical thing, therefore we just need to think about the policies and impose the policies. The best way, I think, to find a parallel is with building regulations for buildings to sustain earthquakes, right? Of course, there are some jurisdictions where an earthquake, even a moderate one, happens and the buildings sustain it, and there are others where the whole city collapses and thousands of people die. Is that because we don't know how to build buildings that sustain earthquakes? No. Is it because there is a complex social thing going on there, namely there are no institutions that collectively ensure that the building regulations are up to the standards? Yes. But these building regulations, they don't just say buildings should sustain earthquakes, full stop, try to do your best, good luck. They actually mandate very strict technical standards, and they're very technical. They're actually overseen, and there are technical inspections, and there are standards that if your building does not fulfill at any point, you're not allowed to build it, you have to bring it down and build it again. Right? These are technical regulations. And very often when people say, oh, we need just policy and regulations, they don't really think we need technical regulation. They really think we need good feelings and intentions. Sadly, this is what effectively data protection was doing so far, and it has failed miserably at actually protecting the privacy of anyone, right? So now we need to a phase shift where actually our regulations, which are indeed policy regulations, need to have technical teeth, right? And I think that we need to shy away from these kind of ideas that just technology or just regulation on its own is going to do the job.
I agree, and coming back to the Brian Carpenter speech, I haven't read that one. I wouldn't go as far as saying he's a founding father of the internet. He's someone that's been involved in the ITF for quite a long time, as have many. I have been involved in it for 15 years, and actually I would say the opposite to what he said. I would say if you look at the ITF compared to other standards bodies like ETSI that does mobile phone standards, like the ITUT, which does all sorts of other standards, actually the ITF is the one that very strongly said, first of all, we will use strong crypto in our protocols, when all of the other, during the time period Wendy was talking about, all those other standards agencies were talking about using broken ciphers, as GSM still does, mobile phones still do. The ITF was also the standards body that said in the 90s, when the FBI came to them and said, we demand that you build lawful intercept capability into your voice over IP protocols, the ITF said no, which was absolutely unthinkable for any of these other standards bodies. I think they were deceived by people from the NSA when they were designing cryptography parts of these protocols, because the NSA has a huge amount of expertise on that, which isn't so easily available in the private sector. And the IETF people naively thought, well, it is in the interests of the United States that we build this infrastructure securely. They just didn't realize perhaps the NSA has been more short-termist in its thinking on that than they hoped.
Okay, I think we've got to wrap for this session. We'll be back at 2 o'clock sharp. If you need food, you cross it that way. That's where there's an enormous amount of calories to be eaten. But first of all, thanks enormously to the 4 speakers here. And thanks for